Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network's Work in Progress seminar series this week, very excitingly, with Vanessa Bartlett. My name is Elizabeth Stevens. I'm so pleased to be welcoming you to this seminar today. And if you would like to receive further updates from the Health and Medical Humanities Network, please feel free to jump on our website and you can subscribe yourself to updates via the website. So I'd like to start our session today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, the Tuggerah and Yurrabul people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I recognise that these have always been lands of and spaces of culture and learning, and I invite all of you, if you would like to introduce yourselves to one another ahead of our discussion after Vanessa's talk in the chat, and to acknowledge the country that you're joining us from today as well. So this is a work in progress series, and we take that name seriously here. It's our space to really, the intention of this series is to provide members of the network and people who might be interested in various of our activities to provide a more informal space to share and discuss projects in the general area of the medical humanities that are still in progress. And so medical humanities is a fairly new field in Australia, and we thought that it was important to have these spaces where we could come together and hear each other's work and have a nice discussion about it afterwards. So it's a discussion focused session, and we are in for a treat today. We have a fantastic presentation ahead. So Vanessa Bartlett is going to share her work on the cultural imaginaries of microbial hacking and the art of Kathy High. I'm going to introduce Vanessa to you all now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and while I introduce Vanessa, she will be able to share her own screen as well. So I will just introduce Vanessa while she does that. So Vanessa Bartlett, who is presenting for us today, is a member of our network, the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network, and she is also a postdoctoral fellow, a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne, where amongst other things, and this amazing rich work that she does, working across the areas of curatorial studies and art exhibitions and the medical humanities and so much more. She is also the leader of this fantastic project that I think we're going to hear a bit more about, called the Stomachache Project. So the format for today is that Vanessa will talk for about 25 minutes, maybe a little longer, and then after Vanessa has finished her presentation, we will have a wonderful response from Claire Hooker. Claire is a wonderful and valued member of the steering committee of our network, and also Associate Professor in the Health, Humanities and Arts and Health at the University of Sydney, where amongst many other things, she runs the Arts and Health New South Wales network as well, an important sister network to this one. So after Claire has given her response, we will have time for open discussion. And I invite you all during the course of this presentation, anytime that you would like to, you can drop your question in the chat during Vanessa's presentation, and then I'll moderate the open discussion after that. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm very excited to hear today's presentation. And the response that follows. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Vanessa now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm assuming you can all hear me. My name's Vanessa. Thank you for being here. Before I say anything else, I will acknowledge that I am on unceded land this afternoon, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge that as a white settler, I have a duty to work towards justice for Aboriginal people and their culture. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to acknowledge the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network for the labour involved in putting on events like this. I'm finding the network a really useful resource for situating my own practice. And, thank you to Elizabeth and her colleagues for the work that goes into building up this network. Also, my final acknowledgement, this work has been developed with the support of Rachel Marsden, Julianne Bell, Chamara Basnaki, and particularly Dr. Lindsay Kelly, who introduced me to the artists that I'll talk about today. And they're my collaborators on the Stomachache project, and you can read more about them on our website. So, as Elizabeth has mentioned, I'll be speaking today about one case study within a much wider body of work. Stomachache started with a one-year seed funding from University of Melbourne Creativity and Wellbeing Hallmark Research Initiative. And having got the one-year funding, I suddenly went, oh, actually, this is probably more like a 10-year project by the time I've done everything that I would like to do. So we are in the very beginning here. This is exactly what it says on the tin. It's work in progress. The broad area that I'm interested in this project is gastrointestinal complaints that don't have a clear organic cause. So about 40% of people experience this kind of condition, but research shows that it's very difficult for them to access proper treatment pathways because of the lack of knowledge, I think, around the gut. We're still at an early stage. And I will say, I'm going to be speaking more about Crohn's disease in this seminar today, which is a different thing. It's different to an undiagnosed functional condition. But what I'm finding in the research is that actually people with Crohn's spend many years undiagnosed before they actually get their diagnosis. So there's a little bit of conflation going on there that I'll be thinking about in terms of the future of the project. So Stomachache has two key research areas. First of all, I'm interviewing people who are experiencing undiagnosed gastrointestinal complaints, and I'm focusing on what do people do when there's a gap in medical care pathways, and how is their relationship with their health a creative and experimental process. So I'm hoping that I can achieve a view of lived experience, which is more focused on the agency of the individual. And this is being explored through interviews with people, as I said, and I won't be talking about this work today, but Stomachache has a presence in the Big Anxiety Forum, which is happening in Melbourne in October, and we'll be speaking to that part of the research at that event. So again, it's on the Stomachache Project website. And you will see the influence of this interest in patient experience on my presentation of Kathy High's work today. So the second part of the project, which is where we're going to be focused today, is how can thinking about creative practice provoke new relationships with the gastrointestinal system? And so I'm focusing on artworks that ask critical questions about human gastrointestinal relations, particularly artists with their own lived experience. And the emphasis is here today through my presentation, Cultural Imaginaries of Microbial Hacking and the Art of Kathy High. One thing that I am going to say, this has ended up being slightly more explicit about, sorry, let me change my slide. This has ended up being slightly more explicitly about fecal microbial transplantation than I initially anticipated. As a nice middle-class lady, this is the first time that I've really spoken about shit quite explicitly in a public forum like this. So I'm still figuring out exactly how to do that. I think people have different levels of sensitivity to this subject matter. So what I'm going to try and do is just very briefly give a warning anytime there's anything slightly more explicit. But Kathy High's work is not confrontational towards its audience. So I don't expect there's going to be anything that's particularly challenging for people, but I just wanted to give that context before I start. So we'll begin with a body of work by Kathy High. You Are My Future is an ongoing investigation into the human condition through the lens of the gut microbiome. It's led by Kathy High, an American interdisciplinary artist associated primarily with the field of what we call bioart. artists working with wet biology and biotechnologies to highlight ethical dilemmas posed by scientific and technological futures. So You Are My Future is a body of work that responds to emerging research about the possible adaptability of the gut microbiome. It begins with the provocation, is our gut a hackable space? And I'm going to speak to several works from this series. So Kathy is both artist and patient with Crohn's disease. Very briefly, Crohn's is a condition that causes chronic inflammation in the bowel, and the cause is poorly understood, although links between the gut microbiome and immune system are thought to be central. So Hai's lived experience really galvanizes her approach to her practice. And what draws me to Hai is the way that her work combines what in the field of medical humanities we might call lived experience, although that of course is a contested term in itself, with techniques and tendencies from the practice of bioart. So in the field of medical humanities, art practice has traditionally been seen as a way of humanizing medicine. So it's been applied in medical education, for example, to try and encourage doctors or other medical experts to become more empathetic. And within this sort of application of art practice in medical humanities, bioart has been noted as a practice that can challenge these maybe slightly more sedate and instrumentalizing approaches with a more radical challenge to medicine. So Hai's work, which is very playful in nature and is made by an artist with insight into the lived experience of illness, I think trains bioart's preoccupation with the biosciences on obsessive research into the future of treatment for a health issue located in the artist's gut. So the story I want to tell today, and I thank the artist for allowing me to tell this story through her work, is about different ways of approaching the intersection between creative practice and lived experience. But it's also about exploration of the possibility of the modification of the artist's microbiome through the practice, as I mentioned, of fecal microbial transplantation. This is a procedure that the artist has made many works about, but has never realized, so the work remains speculative. And for me, this is compelling in relation to where Hai's practice perhaps diverges from some other works of bioart that allude more explicitly to the idea of experimenting on the artist's body. And I'll unpack of everything that I've said in more detail as we go through. So what's going to happen? I'm going to explain the science and cultural significance of FMT. I'm going to use some theory by Claire Pentecost about bioart to kind of frame what is the critical work of bioart as it might relate to Hai's practice. And I'll compare Hai's work to other works of bioart that also propose the idea of experimentation on the artist's own body. And I think I'll come at the end to proposing Hai's practice as one that is driven by care. So the first work that I want to speak about is Bank of Abject Objects. So this work represents an at-home DIY version of a ship bank. The work was inspired by the artist's observation while researching fecal microbial transplantation, that in the near future, people may start freezing their stool when they're young and healthy so that it can be used in a transplantation later in life if their body becomes compromised by something like excessive antibiotic use. So stools float in honey, which is a natural preservative, within sealed glass containers. The stool is ceramic, but this is not explicitly stated. And I think part of Hai's playful approach here is in allowing ambiguity between speculation on science futures and what's real for the audience in the here and now. So stool banks are already a crucial apparatus for storing fecal matter in burgeoning clinical applications of fecal microbial transplantation. So FMT is the practice of taking a stool from a donor and inserting it into a patient's gut. And it's already used in the medical treatment of Clostridium difficile, a tenacious bacterium that infects the gut, causing aggressive illness. The first clinical trial of FMT to treat C. diff showed a 94% success rate, which according to science journalist Ed Yong is exceptional. It's an exceptional success. And I just include Ed Yong's book here because it's one of my main sources of information about FMT. So in I Contain Multitudes, Yong describes how this success has provoked intense speculation about the potential of this treatment for other conditions, one of them being inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's. So again, we see this link here between Hai's lived experience and her practice. I'm now going to just say one sentence quite explicitly about what happens in an FMT. So the clinician pulverizes the stool in a blender and inserts the liquid into the patient via a colonoscopy. So it brings a new, healthier ecosystem of microbes that replace the existing community, overriding a growth of bad bacteria. And Yong describes FMT as a, quote, ecosystem transplant, an attempt to fix a faltering ecosystem by completely replacing it. FMT, it looms large in the cultural imagination, I think partly because of this sensational success, this idea that we can actually use our poo as medicine. But as Matthias and Balleur have pointed out, FMT is also an ancient practice, evidenced in 4th century China, ancient Greece, and featured in several major medical texts of the 16th and 17th century. So Moore and colleagues describe FMT's, quote, historical and transcultural ubiquity. The fact that practices of microbial exchange far precede FMT's so-called innovative status in modern medicine. So explicit image here. Bank of Abject Objects as an artwork is interesting to me because of the bulbous irregularity of the jars and the use of natural materials to preserve the stool, and the way that it refers to practices of microbial exchange occurring via informal networks between people in non-medical environments, potentially, and I'll come back to that. So it refers to this historical and transcultural ubiquity in a way, as well as medical futures. But in a formal medical context, stool needs to be rigorously screened for certain viruses. It can be quite dangerous if screening isn't done properly, and it's very hard to find a healthy donor. There's already a non-profit organization called OpenBiome that is screening and banking stool and providing frozen, ready-to-use human fecal preparations for the treatment of recurrent C. diff. So Hai made a documentary film called Fecal Matters. This is a still from that film, where she interviewed some of the leading FMT researchers, including Dr. Mark Smith, who we see here, who's the research director of OpenBiome. So Smith refers to human stool as, quote, an important medical commodity, which points towards a possible future where the most healthy stool, and remember, healthy stool is really rare, could become economically valuable, shit being turned into gold, if you like. And Yong also alludes to this in I Contain Multitudes, but particularly in relation to synthetic shit being manufactured by private corporations. So the interview with Smith is spliced with images of refrigerated bottle stool stored by OpenBiome. Rows of rectangular plastic containers depict a very different kind of aesthetic to the bulbous glass of Bank of Abject Objects. The next image is a bit more explicit, but it's also a staged image, and it's quite funny as well. In the documentary, one interviewee refers to the fact that FMT is available at a London clinic as a spa therapy. Although it's a fleeting reference, this acknowledges an important collision between microbial adaptation and what we might think of as the wellness industry. And I just want to reflect here for a moment on a sort of adjacent practice of microbial adapting, if you like, which is probiotics. So probiotics are microbes taken orally, and they are already a really lucrative commodity. So for example, the dairy drink Yakult, if anybody's taken Yakult, it's fermented milk containing a single strain of microbes. It sells around 12 billion bottles a year. Even though the evidence for the health benefits of this kind of product is quite limited. So I found Grace Lucas's paper Gut Thinking quite instructive here, particularly in this moment in the paper where she outlines possible intersections between cultural responses to the emerging gut-brain axis research and political imperatives related to enduring equity issues around mental health, particularly. So she says the idea that some people will be enabled to beat or outwit gut bacteria with the right access to the right foods or supplements feeds into a new gut consumer culture wherein some people will be enabled and others disadvantaged. So what I think Hai is doing here in this moment in the Fecal Matters film is training our attention on shifting status from organic body waste to clinical drug, and also potentially a financially lucrative commodity. So this raises crucial ethical imperatives related to safety, of course, screening who has the authority to give these treatments. But it also, perhaps more importantly for me, it raises socio-political questions of money, power, and access, and the hierarchies that might emerge as this kind of gut hacking or microbial adaptation meets with neoliberalism and imperatives around profit making that circulate in science, medicine, and what I've called previously the wellness industry. So this critique for me is part of the critical work that can happen when art meets with science and medicine. And I'm just going to shift gears here slightly and just frame what I've said so far with a little bit of theory from the field of bioart. So in her essay, Outfitting the Laboratory of the Symbolic, artist and researcher Claire Pentecost argues that contemporary bioscience has been co-opted to serve the major hegemony of our time, which is neoliberalism. And it serves the myth in a way that individuals and society flourish best when government protects private property, free markets, and free trade. In simple terms, what she's saying here, drugs and treatments are shaped by how they are funded, and it's not necessarily care-driven agendas that always fund the development of drugs. She's addressing this critique very specifically towards the general state of science and medicine in the US, which is where Hai is practicing, but I think these critiques can apply more broadly. So for Pentecost, the driving force of bioartists like Hai is to leverage critique of these economic forces, posing strategies of interpretation that support greater public access and understanding of what is at stake. So I'll just read this quote from the essay that I find quite useful. So, science in the service of neoliberalism alienates the non-specialist, whose life is profoundly affected by its commercial application. The artist is a person who creates various forms of interruption of these barriers on behalf of herself and other members of an alienated public. So I want to dwell on two things here. The alienated non-specialist, which I'll come to first, and I'll talk about that in relation to FNT. And then I want to talk about this sort of notion of various forms of interruption. What is the interruption in the case of Hai's work as compared to some other works of bioart? So an interesting way for me that Hai's work addresses the nature of non-specialist practice is Bank of Abject Objects, as I've already said, that was the first work that I mentioned. Its shapes and forms refer to sort of, the idea that these are sort of DIY stool banks where stool is kind of being preserved at home in honey. So it's looking at sort of modern medical, it's looking at FMT as something that precedes modern medical applications. Although the artist doesn't actually enact an FMT, and I want to keep a focus on that, her work does allude to what is at stake for a community of non-specialists who are already actively practicing DIY fecal transplantation at home without medical supervision. So the artist doesn't engage with any of these communities, to my knowledge, in a direct way. But I think I want to draw here on what curators Bernhard and Whiteley have said about Kathy's practice, in that it binds together patient perspectives, the hopes, fears, frustrations, and anxieties connected to suffering from a chronic medical condition that the medical establishment is still trying to figure out. While medical insight into Crohn's is in its infancy, Hai's work speculates on how people with lived experience might be putting FMT to work as a form of self-care, of course, bringing with it its own risky ethics. So I want to just talk about an example of a website called The Power of Poop. This is a website that allows people to share their FMT stories online, and it promotes information on how to use FMT to self-treat at home. So it's founded by a Melbourne woman actually called Tracy Mack after using FMT for undiagnosed health challenges related to food intolerance, migraine, and anxiety and depression. In the journal Medical Humanities, Jessica Hauff describes Mack's impetus for founding The Power of Poop as, quote, Mack describes finding an enthusiastic audience in need of the kind of information and support that her website affords. This impetus for patients to want to share and build a support network is very much in response to their own problematic medical encounters. And she goes on to talk about doctors being quite disgusted, but with the idea of FMT, which is a slightly different point to the one that I'm making here. But what this suggests, and it's confirmed by commentary elsewhere in the website, is that this community of DIY transplanters knits together in response to a sense of alienation from the medical mainstream. And indirectly for me, Hai's work carries the traces of this alienation, the way that people with lived experience begin to form risky self-experiments because of limited treatment pathways. And to be clear, I'm not saying, and I don't think Hai is either, that DIY fecal transplantation is the right answer to this. But it does reflect on the lived experience of having an undiagnosed health issue and how people self-experiment around that. And it also sheds light on the unique nature of poo as a drug that we can literally make in our own toilet and how it begins to enable these practices. So I'm coming towards the end now, but I just want to expand on this notion of the self-experiment in Hai's practice, and particularly how it relates to some of the bioart works. Again, I'm going to be really clear. The work remains speculative, and in this way, it's different to other works of bioart that have explored medical ethics and the body. So this is Orlan, who's a very well-known artist who's undergone numerous surgeries to change her face to look more like icons of feminine beauty, such as Botticelli's Venus. This is really provocative work that takes the medical technique of surgery and leverages it to critique cultural ideas of the feminine body and contemporary aesthetics of beauty and health. So her work has been cited in a medical humanities context as an example of using controversy to provoke critique of mainstream medicine, and particularly its tendency to treat the body as machine. And Paul McNeill says in his paper, The Arts and Medicine, A Changing Relationship, that artists like Orlan and Stellark, who is another famous body modifier, who's Australian, go beyond science fiction toward more direct forms of self-experiment on the artist's body. But in these examples of self-experimentation, McNeill points out that there's a confrontational ethics. For example, Orlan's surgery videos ask the viewer to undertake acts of endurance as they watch the facial modification unfold. And Orlan isn't sedated during her operations, but she tries not to show pain. And McNeill points out how this puts this sort of duty of care back on the audience who sort of share in Orlan's pain as they watch. And so I spoke earlier about Pentecost's kind of strategies of interruption of mainstream science and medicine, and the way that bioartists intervene in the economies and practices of science and medicine. And the self-experiment here is one such strategy. The artist putting themselves at risk is a technique that can result in reevaluation of ethics and value systems. But Hai's work stops short of this confrontational ethics. And she's communicated to me that making the Fecal Matters film, which I spoke about earlier, has made her really cautious about putting her own body through this procedure. So what I think emerges from Hai's practice instead is an ethics and aesthetics of care. And I'm interested in how that relates to her lived experience. So this is the final work that I'm going to talk about as I come towards closing. So this final work most strongly alludes to Hai doing her own FMT, but I will argue that it ultimately communicates FMT as a kind of gift exchange or act of care, rather than confrontational ethics or tactics of risk. So a friend asked Hai who would be her ideal donor if she was going to undergo an FMT. And without hesitation, she blurted out David Bowie. So this is a gut response prompted by Hai's hope that, quote, more than a mere organ would be exchanged. So FMT is often referred to as organ transplantation due to its introduction of an entire ecosystem rather than an individual strain of bacteria. And in expressing a wish to acquire more than an organ, Hai is alluding to the significance of the gut-brain axis and our changing scientific understanding of the influence of gut microbes on states of mind and even personality and behavior. So in gut feminism, Elizabeth A. Wilson argues that there's no clear dividing line between mental states and bodied states, and that, quote, the gut is an organ of mind. So if microbes are essential to bodied thinking and feeling, could adopting someone else's microbial ecosystem make us more like them? Could an FMT with Bowie's stool help Kathy become a bit more Bowie? So Hai wrote to Bowie to ask for the gift of his poo. In exchange, she offered photographs of herself as Bowie. Unfortunately, the transfer was never realized, as Bowie was fighting cancer at the time and wasn't able to reply. And the artist didn't know that he was ill at the time. So unfortunately, this project didn't go forward. But Hai reflects that, quote, with that FMT, I might have become a bit of Bowie. Now I can't imagine anyone else's poop inside me. And so although there's risk embodied in the prospect of undertaking this FMT, I think fecal matter here is a medium for the workings of fandom, for care, and even love. And on the right here of the screen, you see the letter that the artist wrote to Bowie, and it's full of love and appreciation. And she says something, I know will be compatible. So I think, what we're seeing here is FMT as gift exchange and a medium for making relationships that differs from some of the more confrontational ethics of other bioartists who are referencing practicing on their own body. So the next stage of my research, I will be creating a context where I might be asking Kathy Hai more direct questions about her work. I haven't interviewed her yet, but I plan to. And I'm going to ask her, how would she have done this FMT if it had been able to go forward? And, has having a chronic health issue like Crohn's influenced the ethics that she builds into her work? I'm really curious about that. So to close, just one final thing that I want to say. I'm also aware of my ethics in speaking extensively about another artist's practice, and particularly in relation to their lived experience. So rather than reiterating my own arguments here, I'm actually going to give the last word to Kathy. And I've picked this quote from here from an essay called Ways in Processing Messages Received, which covers a few works from the You Are My Future body of work. And for me, this kind of shapes some of the essence of what I'm saying about her work as a kind of care-driven approach to microbial transplantation. So she says that as our bodies extend and we understand our microbiome processes and their dissolution into the larger environmental biome, we see that all of us are mountains of varied cells shaping each other. Can we become sensitive to microbial signals in any meaningful way, through telepathy or some other form of sensing? Can we embrace these microbial mutating extensions of ourselves? And if so, can we care for each other in a more simpatico and symbiotic manner? And so I think this idea that we are all microbes and intermingled with other forms of life really shapes High's practice as one that's driven by new forms of care and entanglement. And so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that amazing and rich and lots of food for thought there. I'm worried about metaphors after after your presentation. So much to talk about there. And as I mentioned at the start of your presentation, at any time that anyone would like to pose their question, you can just pop that straight into the chat. But in the meantime, as indicated at the start of the seminar, I'm going to pass over now to Claire Hooker, who will unmute herself for her response. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much. I especially liked how you gave me those extra 10 seconds to do the unmuting, because there may be a great connection between the mind and the gut, but between the mouth and the hand, I often really struggle, especially with the computer as the medium. Thank you so much to you, Elizabeth, for the wonderful work that you've put into setting up and sustaining this network. We're incredibly grateful, and you do it with a lovely light touch, even though it really is quite a lot of extra time and effort, and it benefits a wide community. And thank you for setting up this particular event and for offering me the great privilege of being able to engage with Vanessa's work, and of course to Vanessa for providing such an incredibly rich and thoughtful and beautifully set out talk for everybody, and especially because how fun is just the undergraduate in me is so happy that we get to talk about poo. It's just fantastic. It's kind of where I started my love of the medical humanities, was in being sort of slightly naughty as an undergraduate. I did prepare really just to give you guys something to look at other than listening to me talk, a small PowerPoint. So I will come back to that, but you know, it's so nice to see it with its dynamism and not just the still image for the wonderful Stomachache project. And I'll just begin by my own acknowledgement of country. I know I have a Studios Ghibli Zoom background, but actually I'm joining you from Gundungara country in the Blue Mountains. This is by a local photographer. It's last winter's Christmas in July natural image. And I would really like to, I probably won't have another place to say this, but I'd really like to say that for me, those Aboriginal ways of understanding the world as knowing, being and doing interconnectedly has always seemed to me to be a really awesome way of understanding the role of arts in its intersections with health. And I'd like to acknowledge that leadership and that intellectual orientation here. So look, at the actual slide bit I put together really rapidly. So I'm afraid the actual images are from museums that provided Zoom backgrounds, and are maybe not as thoughtfully chosen as if I'd had lots of time for image selection, but just bear with me. You can see if they have resonances. So I'm just going to start by pausing, just allowing Vanessa's talk to let me think about how far we have traveled. So, you know, I began my role in the medical humanities in 2007. And at that time, the medical humanities was very reactive to the epistemic authority of medicine, which kind of appeared monolithic, really, sort of feudal and fortress-like and liable to exploit and colonize anything that was around it. And it was reactive to the biomedical model and its various reductions. And it was also somewhat reactive, although also quite unaware in other ways, to that very boundaried, individualized model of health that is so dominant in the neoliberal paradigm. In fact, paradigmatically neoliberal in many ways. And it was also very outcomes focused, and that sort of goal-oriented, outcomes focused form of selfhood which so dominates our professional academic lives was, you know, a real feature of work in the medical humanities. And as people, so I just wanted to put that as there we were in about 2007. It's actually not, it doesn't feel like it's that long ago. And as people know, at that time I was grappling with how much the medical humanities at that time kind of exemplified canonical Western culture. And the reason I say this is because I fell in love with art and arts and health precisely because creative practice pulled all of those considerations and concerns, the politics, the hegemony of neoliberalism, the concerns around the way in which medicine would just turn anything else into a consumable resource like the medical humanities. It brought all of these issues into view, and it allowed patients to see themselves and their health issues and health experiences as the product of those sorts of contexts and systems. And I loved art also because it allowed us to see medicine from the inside, not from the outside, but as very partial and as offering only, as being as very partial and as constrained and as having some workings and they're not others. And I loved it because, as well as disrupting and disturbing critiques of power, it enacted that by not being practiced solely in the ivory tower, but by being in that clinic and in the community and in places where multiple people were brought into engagement. And because it was so actively involved in imagining new futures and in opening up new ways of knowing, being and doing. And I really feel like the Stomachache Project, look, and we can go back to that image that's supposed to take us there if it's going to work. Does this. So that's what I wanted to say about the Stomachache Project, is that it shows me how far we have traveled from those days. We no longer have to sit there being reactive to medical epistemic authority and to reductive biomedicine. Instead, the Stomachache Project exemplifies those features about why I fell in love with arts and health. It's built out of lived experience of gastrointestinal discomfort, and also the lived experience of medical uncertainty and the ways in which health systems and health services don't support people when they're navigating through that uncertainty and through all of the ways in which medicine is not able to be responsive because of its many constraints. I love it because it makes visible those constraints and partialities of biomedical knowledge, because we can see it as its own mechanics and the fact that it is so limited in so many ways. But at the same time, it's playfully creating new knowledge that can exist at multiple levels. The new knowledge an individual may gain about their own circumstances and their journeys, the knowledge that we gain collectively through public discourse and engagement, and new knowledges that could be quite effectively instrumentalized in a healthcare space, should you want to take it in that direction from time to time, Vanessa, whilst also resisting some of the constraints that then occur around that. I love it because it equalizes power. I think power was a really strong theme of what is being explored in the Stomachache Project. And it does that through agency. And it does that, the agency is through the invitation for creative engagement. And it's through that it contributes new knowledge and to asking new questions. And I like it because the other thing it does that does so well by Arts and Health is that it connects people with and explores what affective embodied knowledge might be about, and how the qualia of experience are connected to, shaped by and shape huge social and economic systems. So my sense of how far we have come is to say, you know, here in the Stomachache Project, all of our frames of knowledge have changed. The body really is no longer bounded. It just isn't now. We have we've gone way beyond leaky. We've gone beyond leaky to networked and interconnected. It contains flows, is flows and ecosystems, and we know that those are shaped by multiple networks and exchanges in the global world as well as the world within. And the Stomachache Project invites us to ask what practices, values, ethical concepts, and creative engagements we need to understand a truly postmodern world that is always uncertain, always dynamic, always, dare I say, more than representational. And I would bring that body of theories into conjunction to this work. Having see if I can return. Can I return to this? I can. Having reflected on that journey and given a response to how I situate the Stomachache Project as a kind of exemplary version of what is happening in the intersections between arts and health on an exploratory level. In terms of practice and knowledge creation, I come to the bit where I have some ideas and questions and comments that might take us into some discussion. And I want to say that my first couple of comments and the questions that they lead to are in the spirit of staying complex. So, you know, some of the exciting work in this space, both in terms of the theorization of bioart, but also I hadn't read the Grace Lucas article that you alluded to, but I really love it, Vanessa. I thought it was a terrific article. And it is strongly an invitation to thinking, not quite flipping dualisms on their head, but remaining in the complexity that happens when we are constantly aware of them and destabilize them. So these questions are in that spirit of maintaining that complexity. So the first are about the political economy of health. So my first comment is about open biome and the commodification of FMT. And my comment here is simply that this is actually one of several really now complex systems that include patients, advocates, community members, carers, physicians, researchers, ethicists, and entrepreneurs. Where all of those people who are involved are struggling, in which you have a situation where there is early evidence that suggests some efficacy and sometimes even transformative treatments. But at the same time, the science is at such a preliminary stage that understanding the complexities just of the scientific picture are not even really have emerged. And it's going to be some time before we will know whether these are treatments of promise, or whether, to be frank, largely the history of medicine, in my view, is a history of showing that pretty much nothing works outside context effects. Few things, backing vaccines. Really happy when I take painkillers for my period pain. Outside that, have a lot of skepticism. You know, in medicine, we talk about the file drawer problem. It's very well known that the most common phenomenon of new pharmacological treatments is that they go through the multiple levels of evidence. They go through systematic, they go through lots of levels of randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews. They get released and we start gathering data on effectiveness in the real world. And they start off showing great amounts of effectiveness. And if you wait 20 years, their levels of effectiveness will drop back to close to not much better than placebo. So this is a really common phenomenon, and we could be seeing that here. And we have a long time before we get to that. And in the meantime, we have systems of commercial access, and they spring up to both exploit patient vulnerability and respond to patient agency and need, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference. And stem cells are a really classic comparable example in this space. So I guess my first comment is that this work is highly relevant for ongoing very live discourse in bioethics. In fact, I'm involved in a stem cell transplant bioethics study, and I suspect there's a lot of really interesting possibility for interaction between bioethics research and this project and work, both in problematizing and also remaining close to that complexity. Of course, all of us are interested in how we explore, understand, engage with, and get patients to engage with issues around regulation, safety, screening, priority access, and so on. Even epistemically, how do we even tell what is promising, what is reliable evidence? And again, live from the stem cell debate, I can tell you that is not an easy question to answer. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, I loved the other article that you referenced, the theory of bioart, slightly less than I loved the Grace Lucas article. So what I want to say is, what I particularly love about the Stomachache project and about the gut microbiome specifically that's distinctive is how it forces us into maintaining a focus on the devalued components of neoliberal dualisms that have such strong influence over our work lives. Namely, it forces us to centralize process, dynamics, instability, leakiness, complex emergent systemic reactions. And the reason I say this is because probiotics and synthetic poo cannot do what a fecal microbial transplant can do. Because the point of a fecal microbial transplant is not a magic bacterium, which is what you get from Yakult, which is actually a monoculture. What you are after is an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem that is dynamically living and formed out of its connections with the world, with playing in the dirt or not playing in the dirt, with what the mother ate, what's in her vaginal tract as you were born or not born, what food production, hygiene, and urban design systems afford or don't afford in contributing to those ecosystems. It's a point of connection. So the model is not, the problem is not that people with money who can afford to access poo that's pure gold are going to get an advantage because they're never going to be mentally ill. That's not what's going to happen here. That's not the disadvantage we're talking about. Why? Because mental health is itself a construct of neoliberal societies, and it's appeared because of the way those societies produce a multitude of suffering, and including by the disruption of ecosystems. And you cannot just magic them back up through commodified gold poo access systems because other forces are at work. So I just want to keep that complexity there. Okay, so that's that. Art in theory and as practice. Look, I'll just say very quickly, I thought the second article was a little bit in danger of suggesting that only bioartists were the really radical ones in the room. And I actually think that scientists are too. And that science is not just about making, even in the service of neoliberalism, which, you know, was referred to as big science. Maybe there's big science that places people, lay publics at disadvantages, but science itself is a process of professionalized skepticism that is in itself a very, very complex system of its own, driven often by really, really strong commitments to social justice in various forms. And I want to ask, is it an art? It's certainly been understood as an ethics, and how might that matter, and how might we engage with that epistemically? So I'm going to finish with these two questions to set off the discussion. Grace Lucas, in turning the distinction between the brain and the gut upside down and suggesting that we think not with our brains, but with our microbiome, which is lovely, and I love that, asks this terrific question: how is the gut thinking? And I wonder if that's an incitement to part of the creative, playful practice that people might have in exploring experiences of gastrointestinal distress, illness, and healing. And since you also mentioned Paul McNeill and his provocations around art and ethics, I thought I would use his question that motivated his 2014 Ethics and the Arts book and ask this question, which is, rather than simply about care, although we can have that discussion and there's a real focus right now about how art provides means of care, I'm going to ask a slightly different question. Is art another way of doing ethics? And that's it for me.
Fantastic, Claire. Thank you so much for those really thought-provoking responses and the questions that you asked as well. I want to, if I may, Claire, actually link from the last questions that you were asking to Vanessa. So rather than Vanessa asking you to respond directly to Claire, if I may, in the interest of time, because we only have a few minutes left in our session, is mediate Claire's fantastic questions at the end there and the richness of that discussion, so much to unpack, in relation to one of the questions that's come through from the audience as well. So Vanessa, I have a question here from John, who asked, to what extent can artistic depictions of FMT influence perceptions of this technology, be it public acceptance or public aversion? So this goes to some of the questions that Claire was asking at the end there. Would you like to respond, Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I often think about what's the relation, to answer this on quite a simple level, what's the relationship between art practice and journalists as the kind of intermediary of public perception of artistic practice. And so I think, you know, so much to say in response to everything that Claire said and in answer to this question. If you look at someone like Orlan, and I was aware in some ways that bringing Orlan in, that work is a little bit, the comparison maybe lacks a bit of complexity just in terms of Orlan being a very sensational artist who kind of captures the public imagination. Everybody knows Orlan and her role as a kind of sensationalized public artist. And so I think, yeah, just being very pragmatic, I think to some extent it depends on journalistic responses to the artistic work in terms of how that influences public perception. I mean, I think the goal of most artistic practice is actually to give people a space to dwell in complexity. And I love everything that Claire said there about keeping things complex, because I think that's so important. And when we speak to, again, something that Claire said about the different actors that operate around FMT, it's complex networks of community stakeholders, of scientists, of entrepreneurs, you know, that there's all of this, these complex networks of stakeholders around FMT. And so I think, I've forgotten where I was going with this, but I think in terms of, we have to keep complexity as much as possible. And I think artistic practice can be a way of, there's something that Paul McNeill says in that article about not reducing things to simplistic narratives. And I think that is what I would like to see as the role for artists in relation to public opinion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vanessa. And I really love the way that you were picking up on Claire's really important comments there, especially about the role of complexity and the complexity of that relationship between science and art and ethics as well, which is the kind of nexus that you're looking at. Vanessa, I'll let you know, I'll capture the chat afterwards, but you're getting some references to other things that you might like to have a look at as well. And so Aaron Katz has sent through a link looking at, I think it's probably an exhibition on called Mind the Gut,
Yes.
which will be a reference for you. And Melissa Dixon, thank you, has sent through a reference. She's a literary historian, so she's sent through a literary reference for you to follow up afterwards. Claire, did you want to come back to your final questions for Vanessa and pose those now?
Well, actually, I feel bad that I had imagined that we expansively went until 6 and that there would be lots of chatter for the next half hour, and instead it was the sound of my voice, which I really didn't want to have happen. So anybody else who would like to make a comment, or if there's time for anybody else to engage, that would be
There
preferable.
absolutely is. Everyone is thanking you, Claire, for your wonderful response, and to Vanessa for her wonderful paper. Vanessa, we have a moment or so more. So if I may, one of the things that really struck me, and this is following on from Claire's comments about that nexus between the arts and science and the ethics that you were looking at, but it struck me that a lot of what you were talking about in terms of, and this goes back to John's question as well about public perceptions of fecal transplants. So a lot of what you were talking about, especially in the context of the kind of wellness industry, is this very hyper individualized way of understanding the results of fecal transplant, that they have it's designed to change an individual's health status or so on. But at the same time, like your reference to, I love the Elizabeth Wilson book as well on gut feminism, and your references at the end are about the problematization of the relationship between the brain and the gut, which decentralizes how we understand the individual. And then even more so if we have a connection between microbiomes and a larger environment, which you concluded your paper with, we have this again, the decentralization of the individual at the heart of that. So I wondered, drawing on Claire's idea of the importance of complexity in the midst of this, how you understood that tension between, on the one hand, these individual frameworks for understanding fecal transplants, and on the other hand, the extent to which they problematize our idea of the individual.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're speaking there, Elizabeth, what comes to mind for me is actually something that Kathy High says about her autoimmune condition. So in one of the essays that I read about her practice, I forget which one it was, there's this beautiful quote where she talks about having Crohn's disease as not as a kind of an illness, but actually a microbial adaptation to a changing environment. And I think what she's alluding to there is, perhaps some of the emerging research about the fact that our microbiome does seem to be changing in response to things like Western diet, potentially antibiotics in food. Like, we as a species are adapting in terms of our microbiome. Some of the research suggests that. And what Kathy High proposes is that actually, her microbiome is adapting in turn. She is a kind of progressive microbiome as a non-normative kind of sufferer of an illness, but she's also a kind of radically adaptive and responsive microbial agent. And I think, that entanglement between our personal microbes and the world around us is something that's really important in Kathy High's work.
Fantastic.
So yeah, go ahead.
Great response, Vanessa, and we're getting lots of comments in the sidebar here, and in particular, John has responded to your response, Claire, saying that, oh, it makes him wonder if the gut is thinking freely. And we have another reference. Thank you so much, Aaron, who was mentioned, After Many a Summer by Aldous Huxley, as another text that you might want to have a look at. And lots of comments and thanks to both of you, Vanessa and Claire, for such a wonderful and rich dialogue between your two presentations. This really fantastic presentation on your work, Vanessa, and on the the work of Kathy High and how that fits into the work that you're looking at and resonates with the kinds of things that you're looking at. And Claire, I really appreciated the way that you put that into the larger context of medical humanities in Australia. For us, it's so important that we start thinking about how to do that. And then all the thought-provoking questions and comments that you made about that really helped us situate Vanessa's work too. And I can see I'm not alone in enjoying the dialogue between both of your fantastic presentations, because you have lots of thanks in the chat on this session as well. So absolutely fantastic session. Thank you both so much for your wonderful presentations. We're all looking forward to seeing where your work goes and to having an opportunity, everyone, to continue this discussion in the sessions that we will have ahead. So thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your wonderful comments and questions. And most of all, please join me in thanking our two speakers for today, Vanessa Bartlett and Claire Hooker.